Hey and welcome back. I'm Joe Carswell and this trades training video is all about the Jigsaw. Let's get right into it. We are really trying to grow this channel, and the best way for that to happen is for you, the viewer, to subscribe. Also, if you learned something from these videos, don't forget to click like. So thanks for your support. Let's get back into the lesson. Let me start by saying this is a specialty tool. It's not one that you're going to use all of the time, but when you need it, it will do the job. This tool, unlike a lot of the ones that we talk about, is made for curved cuts. A lot of our tools are engineered for straight cuts. This one is completely different, and therefore we have to think of it different. The closest tool to compare this one to would be a reciprocating saw, and that's only in the way that the blade moves. It takes a straight blade and it pushes it in a straight line, which is the reciprocating action of the tool. And instead of a reciprocating saw that is back and forth, this one is basically up and down. You're generally using this tool on a flat surface, not to say that it couldn't be used on a vertical surface, but just keep in mind the way the blade moves in relation to the base, which is the other part of this saw. Let's go over the parts of this saw and how they make it work. Starting, we mentioned the blade. These blades come in a lot of different tooth counts and styles for different materials. It's a quick change blade, quick action. To change it, it can come out and go in very easily. Next up, we have the base plate. A lot of our power tools have base plates. This one is no exception. This base plate is not as big as some of our other power tools, but it is flat and should slide along the surface very smoothly. Next up, we have the guide roller, and this roller allows this blade to stay straighter. One problem with a tool that cuts a curve is as you're cutting the curve, it's putting tension on that blade. That can flex this blade. Typically, we want to make a square cut. That's the most common cut we want to make. And the more we're jigging or turning this saw back and forth, it can flex that blade, which will put an angle or bevel on our cut. That's not ideal. We always want that square cut. One thing to mention too is the depth of material that this blade will cut. It has a limit to about 3/4. You might be able to push it to an inch thick material, but beyond that, this is not the right tool to use. So it's good for cutting panels, in other words. Next up, we have the variable speed trigger. This trigger, like a cordless drill, allows us to, as the operator of the tool, allows us to control the speed of the blade anywhere from very slow to very fast. And a lot of the control during the cut has to do with how well we control that variable speed trigger, just like a cordless drill. There is a variable speed adjustment on this trigger. It's a little dial that sits on the trigger, and we'll show you this in a close-up here so you have a better view of it. When you turn that dial, it sets the maximum speed of the saw from slow to fast, and that allows you even more control while you're making your cuts and using that trigger. So the handle here is a large handle. I would say this is kind of a one-handed saw. It's not a bad idea to have two hands on it in certain situations, but it's easily controlled with one hand. This is typically going to be your dominant hand. And if you have another hand, it generally goes here to keep the contact from the base to the surface. So this would be a secondary placement of the hand. Keep in mind that this blade is fairly exposed, just like a reciprocating saw. So you should not have any hands or fingers anywhere in this area here. It's not that well protected, although there is some type of a blade guard here. I would not trust it. So even if you have your hand here, it just keeps it out of the way of that moving blade. Also on this tool, on the backside, there is a trigger lock, which is an interesting feature on any tool. I don't recommend using it. I would remove this if I could take this tool apart. I would take this feature off or redesign it. What that does is when you push the switch all the way in, you can push that button in, and now it holds that trigger steady on its maximum speed. This does not lead to any control or make any logical sense to me. You always want to have your finger on the trigger. If something was to go awry, now this tool will run until somebody presses this trigger in, and that's the only thing that will release that lock. So know that this is here only because when I'm holding the tool, that's generally where my thumb goes. and you might release the trigger and the tool does not stop running. It means that you've inadvertently pressed this trigger lock. The way to release it is always to just press that trigger and it will release that lock and the tool will stop. The next feature on this saw is the orbital adjustment. So this saw has a linear motion to the blade when it's set with no orbital motion. That means the blade will move in a completely a straight line. When I turn this orbital adjustment on, which actually it's set on the highest setting here, it will add a forward motion to the saw while it moves up and down. That translates to almost a circular or elliptical motion of the blade. What that does, it increases the aggressiveness of the cut. The tool will cut much faster when it's set on a higher number. If we set it to 0, which is down, that means no orbital motion, and this makes a cleaner cut but a slower cut. So you have to decide what's the material you're cutting through, what is the finished quality of that cut, and which setting works best for you. One other adjustment we can make on a jigsaw is the tilt or angle of the base plate relative to the blade. So the blade sits here, we can tilt this base this way, side to side, which will change the angle of the blade to the material. We can make a bevel cut with this saw. I don't recommend it. I've never in my life made a cut like that with this tool. There's better tools to make those bevel cuts with. But the good news about this adjustment is there's a simple screw here. It loosens this base plate. And if we want to true this base plate to our blade, which we want it to be perpendicular to this blade, we can make those fine adjustments, tighten that up, and now we have a much more square cut with a jigsaw. Last thing to talk about is the power cord. Most jigsaws have a short cord. You will need a drop cord or an extension cord to carry this to an outlet or a power source. And generally, most of these tools are double insulated. That means we don't have a ground prong on here. So there's nothing wrong with this plug. It's just a polarized 2-prong plug, and that's what we need to run this saw. Changing the blade on a jigsaw is a snap. There's a small lever up here, and different jigsaws are different. I have other jigsaws that are a little more complicated, but this one has a small lever. You pull this lever, it loosens a clamp here that's holding this blade, and then we can just pull that blade out. We need to install the new blade. It goes right up into that space or that slot, and we want to rest that blade in our roller guide groove right in the middle. Now we release that clamp, it will hold that blade. You might want to give it a little tug to make sure you did it right. And that's all that it takes. Keep in mind, if you're changing a blade, you not only want to have that saw unplugged when you do it, but you also do not want to reach in and grab a blade that's been working through a cut. It tends to get hot from the friction and you can burn yourself pretty easily. So before we actually make a cut, let's run through the process of it. And I'm running it along the edge of my box here so you can kind of see how this whole thing should go. I've got a panel on top of a framed box, and the idea here is we want to cut through this panel only. So we need to first make sure that the thickness of our panel is not so thick that our blade can't run through it. As you can see here, I have plenty of blade length beyond that panel. Number two is we need to be very aware of what's under this panel or on the other side, and that we're not cutting something that we don't want to cut. All we want to do is cut this panel. If you're using this tool in the field or somewhere, you might be cutting through nails that you don't want to cut. This blade might be a wood-only blade. It could be that you're cutting through plumbing or you're cutting through electrical. There's a lot of problems you can run into. So investigate what is behind this panel and make sure that your path of wanting to cut is free so this blade can move and you don't have to worry about that. Next thing you want to do is to pull the trigger, but you don't want to pull it all at once. You want to kind of ease into this cut. And if this saw is going to jump, it's going to be in the very first motions of that blade through the material. This is when that other hand up here will make a lot of sense. Now when I pull that trigger, I'm just going to smoothly move this tool through the material. And if I'm turning left or right, I need to be following a mark. Typically, it's going to be a circle or some kind of curved specific shape that I'm trying to follow. I'm watching the blade as it passes through that mark. I'm using my trigger, and as we get into the cut, we can increase the speed and listen to the blade. If it's binding or struggling, then we're pushing too hard, or there's some problem, or we have something underneath that we're hitting. So you as the user have to listen and investigate while you're making the cut. Is this happening like you want it to happen? And the steering of this tool will happen in this hand through the handle, and we can move it. There's a limit to the radius or the amount of curve you can cut with different blades. If you need a really tight or small circle radius, you might need a blade that's not as deep as this one. You will, only by using this tool, figure out the limits of each blade, and based on your speed and your motion and your steering of your hand, you will be able to control those cuts any way you need to. If you're in the middle of a cut and you have problems, just let go of the trigger, stop, pull the tool out of the cut, investigate what's going on, then you can drop it back into the same slot, back it off a little bit, start it up, and then continue your cut. So now we'll draw a line on this box that we'll need to cut and follow with our tool. Time to make a cut. There's a little bit of a setup to talk to you about here. I've got my panel, I checked underneath, nothing in the way of this cut. I took a paint can and drew a circle here. This is random, but similar to maybe something you would do on a job in the field. I drew it with a Sharpie so that the camera can see it, but keep in mind this is a pretty thick line. My goal here when using this saw is going to be to run it right in the middle of this line. I'll use that as my guide. The other problem is I need to get the blade in to get started. So the easiest way to do that is to use a drill bit. This is a quick way to access a hole that then I can put the blade in and get started. So I'll go ahead and drill that. And I want to make sure this hole doesn't come outside of this cut. My goal here is to have this centerpiece be my scrap, and the outside is the clean cut, if you say, when it's all said and done. So I'll go ahead and drill this hole. So I have this hole right up to the edge of my line. Now it's time to make my cut. So I'll drop this saw in. And one thing, I'm going to start this saw, and I won't be talking to you quite as much, but you have to keep your line visible. So you might be just having to blow some of the sawdust out so you can keep a nice clear eye on that line. So keep in mind that sawdust builds up in front of this saw. Make sure you keep it clear. Here we go, starting really slow and keeping pressure down with the base plate solid on the material. You can reposition yourself at any point, stop the saw, pull it out of the cut. I'm going to run it in the other direction now because I have a much better angle on this. So I'll drop it in, get it nice and flat, and get it started. Also, one thing to mention, this blade's starting to wander a little bit. Make sure that it's in the groove of the roller bearing or the guide bearing. And also, if you get a little off on your cut, if it starts to wander, it's no big deal to stop the saw, back it up, and reposition or start to turn that saw. When you start it back up again, you can create a different direction with the blade. So at this point, our cut is all finished. The piece drops away and I have a continuous circle cut out of my panel. So that's it with the Jigsaw. Great for curves, also very good for finishing out cuts. If you use a circular saw and you're trying to make a corner, though that circular blade can't finish out those cuts, you could then run this tool through there to complete those cuts. Keep in mind, this tool will cut any shape. It can even cut squares, rectangles, triangles, as well as circles. So I hope that makes sense. I hope you learned something about this tool. It'll be the one you need at that moment you need it, and it's the only one that will get the job done. So thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next lesson. This video is a production of Trade Skills U, all rights reserved.